more minutes to please join the meeting. PowerPoint presentation is going to be on budget proposals, and this is going to be something that's going to be relevant next month for our SBDC program. We're going to be preparing for calendar year 2018 already, which is hard to believe, but that is going to be the case. So I wanted to take time to go over what's going to be entailed in that preparation and some of the basic terms that you should be aware of before you start preparing your budget proposal. So your budget proposal is going to be looking at how you plan to spend your federal funds, as well as how you plan to spend your cash match, any in-kind donations that you might be getting, and any program income, any funds that are related to running your SBDC program. When you're developing the SBDC budget, the following 3 terms need to be considered and kind of at the top of your mind through the whole process, and these terms are reasonable, allowable, and allocable. And that's the case when you're developing your budget, and then when you turn around and you're going to spend money and process your expenses. That's always what you're thinking, is that this is taxpayer money, and are you being a good steward of that money, and would a reasonable person think that this is an acceptable, normal business expense? So the definition of reasonable, besides sort of your gut level definition of reasonable, is a cost is reasonable if, in its nature and amount, it does not exceed that which would be incurred by a prudent person under the circumstances prevailing at the time the decision was made to incur the cost. The question of reasonableness is particularly important when the non-federal entity, which is all of us, is predominantly federally funded. In determining reasonableness of a given cost, consideration must be given to whether the cost is of a type generally recognized as ordinary and necessary for the operation of the non-federal entity, or proper and efficient performance of the federal award. The restraints or requirements imposed by such factors as sound business practices, arm's length bargaining, federal, state, and other laws and regulations, and terms and conditions of the federal award. Market prices for comparable goods or services of the geographic area, whether the individuals concerned acted with prudence in circumstances considering their responsibilities to the non-federal entity, its employees, where applicable, its students or membership, the public at large, and the federal government. Whether the non-federal entity significantly deviates from its established practices and policies regarding the incurrence of costs, which may unjustifiably increase the federal award cost. So you can find more information about this under uniform guidance, and it's giving you the reference for that if you need to look at the CFR. so I'll kind of go through this, and if there are any questions, then please hold off and we'll kind of discuss those at certain points. So the next concept is allowable. Factors affecting allowability of costs, and it's giving you the reference for the uniform guidance. So allowable, except where otherwise authorized by statute, costs must meet the following general criteria in order to be allowable under federal awards. Be necessary and reasonable for the performance of the federal award, and be applicable thereto under these principles. Conform to any limitations or exclusions set forth in these principles or in the federal award as to types or amount of cost items. Be consistent with policies and procedures that apply uniformly to both federally financed and other activities of the non-federal entity. Be accorded consistent treatment. A cost may not be assigned to the federal award as a direct cost if any other cost incurred for the same purpose in like circumstances has been allocated to the federal award as an indirect cost. And so we've talked about indirect costs at different times, and this is where there's a reminder that we can't be sort of double counting what we're charging directly to the grant and what we're saying is an overhead F&A cost that the host is incurring. And this is a reference to that. Okay, also with allowable, be determined in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles or GAAP, except for state and local governments and Indian tribes only, as otherwise provided for in this part. And not be included as a cost or used to meet cost sharing or matching requirements of any other federally financed program in either the current or prior period. And so this is a reference where there's the federal funding, we have a one-to-one match requirement, and it would not be allowable to say that you were using certain cash match funds to match this SBA grant and maybe a different SBA grant, like a Women's Business Center grant, or any other federal program that has a matching requirement. And the last part is be adequately documented. So you can see the uniform guidance and national policy requirements and those references, and ensure that the expense is happening during the period of performance. So those are the statutes and the regulations of what allowable is. The last term is allocable. Allocation means the process of assigning a cost or a group of costs to one or more cost objectives in reasonable proportion to the benefit provided or other equitable relationship. The process may entail assigning a cost directly to a final cost objective or through one or more intermediate cost objectives. So this is where some of you do time studies, and then your center decides that there's, you have a policy that says we have, I'm thinking of Mendocino in this case, that they spend such and such amount of time on different grants, and they will look back and say, okay, over the last 6 months, we spent, I think at the fiscal review I did on last Friday, it was 44% of their time on SBDC programs. So therefore they allocated 44% of their rent and 44% of their supplies and different costs to the SBDC program based on their time studies over the prior 6 months, and they'll keep doing that on a rolling basis, doing time studies and updating the percentages that they're charging to their various grants. And there's different ways to do that, but that's one example. Okay, so that's the kind of the 3 big terms that I wanted to go over before we dive into the budget proposal and the different sections. I think everyone might be on mute right now, but if you need to unmute yourself, if you have some questions, then please feel free to ask some questions, and I can give some more examples, etc., to help clarify these terms. Okay, we will forge ahead. The budget proposal sections. So in May, I am hoping, the only concern would be if we at the host lead center do not get our budget proposal instructions from Washington, D.C., then we can't push down the budget proposal instructions to the centers. But if we stay on schedules that we have in the past, then about the middle of May, I should be sending out the instructions for the budget proposals, and then you'll have 30 days to complete those. And especially for centers that are hosted by junior colleges, this works well, because otherwise the faculty and administrators who need to sign off as for the host end up disappearing early to mid-June usually for a lot of the summer, and are hard to track down for signatures. So that's one important reason too. So there's several different parts to the budget proposal. It's your entire plan for 2018. The first page is going to be a cover sheet, and that's going to tell us at the lead center and our host sponsored programs, where are we sending your contract to in 2018? Who's going to be the person that's going to be listed as your host contact, and who's going to be signing as your host, and what is their title, and basic contact information as far as phone numbers, etc. And then there's also some debarment certification and other places that need to be signed off, certification regarding lobbying, etc. And then the budget certification, this is where you're going to be listing your sources of match funding. And so you're going to be planning out, okay, last year, perhaps you had, the GoBiz contract, and we are planning on getting GoBiz funding again this next year, if that is one of the grants that you have for match. And perhaps you have CDBG, perhaps you have some other contracts from counties, and you're anticipating that you will get them again in 2018. And so some of them you might have in hand and they might be signed off. Other ones you don't have yet, but you're anticipating that the amounts will be the same or less perhaps, but you'll put those amounts down. And then the detailed budget, that's your budget justification, and you're going to put down your cost categories of your personnel, your fringe, travel, supplies, etc. there, and include the correct descriptions. The next section is the budget narrative, where you need to include a little bit of information, additional information about each of the costs that you put on item number 3, the detailed budget. And I always tell people that if you listed a dollar amount on your detailed budget, you have to have some wording on the budget narrative next to it, even if it's redundant, even if you feel like you've already given all the information on the detailed budget. I'm not sure if Washington reads the budget narrative that much, but they notice if you've got a dollar amount and there's no wording next to it. That's what they do notice. So we need to make sure that there's no blanks. And then 5, waived indirect calculator. And that's something that's set up in Excel to auto-calculate to assist with the waived indirect being complete and accurate. And then the next one is planned milestones. So this gets into, we're switching gears and getting into a programmatic piece. And this is where it'll be auto-calculating off of your federal funds that you're being awarded. It will auto-calculate your portion of the region's milestones. And then service center locations. Last year, the 2017 list will be provided to you, and so this is a time for you to look at that, see if that's correct. And if you have satellite locations or outreach locations, you need to type in your initials as if you're the program director and say, yes, I've reviewed this, these are correct, or I've reviewed this and you've made the changes needed that that centers, outreach locations or satellite locations have maybe changed. And then we have closure dates. And according to SBA, there cannot be more than 14 days that a service center can be closed to the public. So if, the director is going on vacation or things like that, how is that going to be accomplished? What's the coverage going to be so that the center is not open? And then planned workshops. So, we're not asking for perfection, but which workshops do you anticipate having? And I think it's broken out into quarters. And how often do you have a basic bookkeeping workshop, and are you offering it 3 times every quarter? Or did Alameda contracts with different counties and cities to provide some training workshops that have kind of become an annual event, and so they could probably list out, what those are and how often they're going to be offered. So kind of looking at last year's plan if you're making any changes to it. And then an organizational chart, and that would be showing the SBDC director who they report up to, and then which staff and advisors report to them. And even if you have consultants who are independent contractors, if you can show kind of a dotted line to the SBDC director, that, it's not a typical employee org chart, but just that the director does have oversight of those. So I'm going to, let's see, just sort of, I'm trying to figure out if it's best to kind of keep budgets are comprised. Yeah, I'll keep going through this, and then I'll switch over to the proposal template, and we'll go through kind of an example and talk through that. So there's several cost categories that you should be becoming familiar with the SBDC program. And the first one, when you're looking at the budget, is personnel. And this is where you're going to list the name and title of all personnel charged to the federal and non-federal funds. And these are the direct costs. For vacancies, if there's an anticipated vacancy, show the position title in the budget justification. If additional space is needed to explain the cost, include in the budget narrative. So that's where I was saying there's 2 different pages. There's one where you really do give a lot of the information, and then there's a second page to give supplemental information, or maybe you're kind of repeating yourself, it depends. Then use the personnel list to show annual salary, number of months, level of effort. Okay, this is something actually that the lead center does, so that you do not have to worry about that, but that's part of our region proposal. Fringe benefits. So as a service center, you're responsible for indicating the fringe rates as approved by your cognizant federal agency for audits when available. If not available, provide the schedule used. Do not include fringe costs in the total amount required for personnel. So they're saying that you need to break out the fringe benefit rate. And that is different than if your center has a state GoBiz grant, they want a loaded rate. So that's what's always confusing is SBDC has a different system than GoBiz does. And different grants have different systems, but so for this one, they want the personnel cost and the fringe cost separately. And we need to be able to see if you have a rate sheet for your benefits or how you're calculating your benefits and what policy you're following to do that. For travel, provide total anticipated mileage and mileage rates. And for this year, for 2017, the mileage rate that we have is 53.5 cents. So we'll just anticipate that that'll be the case in 2018, even though we don't know for sure. They might change it later, but that's all we'll have to go on for now. For out of state or out of region travel, and including foreign travel, provide estimated cost and justification, which includes the purpose, the destination, the mode of transportation and rate, such as airfare or mileage, number of trips, and number and position of travel, and the position of the travelers. So they're asking for a lot of information, and they want you to be as detailed as possible. And again, we're not asking for perfection, but as much detail as you can provide, ballparking how many nights of travel and who's traveling, etc., is helpful. The other thing to point out is that in the out-of-state travel, that is a bit strange in California because we're one of 2 states in the nation that is divided up into regions, California and Texas. And so any other state, there is just one state lead center. So if we were in Oregon, there would be a state lead center, and that's where I would work. However, we've got these different regions, and so traveling out of state and traveling out of region means that you are traveling outside of the geographic area that SBA has designated your grant money to be spent in. And therefore, they're asking for justification of why is it that you're traveling outside of your designated area that you're supposed to be serving. And there's reasons for that. Like we went to the state conference in Irvine that was an all-state conference, or you go to SBDC, which is a national conference, or things like that, but they're just asking for additional information. Equipment is another cost category. List items costing at least $5,000 and having at least 1 year of useful life. I have never seen any center list anything here, so this is one that we don't worry about that much. I think maybe a long, long time ago when computers used to be more expensive, they would perhaps be listed here, but computers have been moved to a supply over the past years. The recipient organization must maintain an inventory of equipment purchased and the location and detailed description of each item. But again, I haven't seen a center do this. So supplies, this is where computers would also, you would put an expense for a computer. Show anticipated cost of supply items such as general office, operational, computer supplies, and other supply items costing less than $5,000. The recipient organization must maintain an inventory of controlled supplies of higher dollar value and high potential for loss, such as computers, and it must be available upon request of the SBA. So I think most of you are aware of the equipment form that we have you turn in at year end. And this is where, we maybe need to think about changing the title of it, because as you can see, I think just historically it was computers, et cetera, were called equipment, and now they're called supplies. And so maybe we could work on coordinating the names a bit better with the cost categories, but you can kind of see the historical elements there. Contractual. List costs for contractual services that support program operations, such as website support, equipment maintenance, or meeting facilitation. So this is not your business advisors. If you have them, if you contract with your business advisors, this is not where you put it. We'll talk about that in a minute. So this is everything else. If you have an IT person who comes in and, helps to fix your computers if they need maintenance, if we've hired website people to help with the region website recently, we've hired people, Eric Ryan for meeting facilitation recently at region meetings. So this is where those costs would go for the lead center budget. Provide budget details, including name of contractor, statement of work, number of hours, and rate of pay. If applicant proposes to contract with another entity to provide SBDC client services, which is called a subrecipient, costs for the subrecipient contract may be included in the contractual line, but the applicant must also include a separate budget justification with cost detail by line item for each subrecipient. So this, trying to think right off the top of my head, that I think I've seen this happen in Napa-Sonoma as well as Santa Cruz's budgets, where they are community colleges. They get a larger award from the chancellor's office, and they have said, I'm going to do a subcontract with another entity, and that entity is going to be providing business services or workshops, etc. And that is client services, but Napa, Sonoma, or Santa Cruz are not directly paying the business advisors. They're paying another host organization. I guess that's the distinction. So it doesn't apply to a lot of people, but this would be one anomaly that some centers would use. So business consultants, this is where most of the centers in our region do hire independent contractors to provide business advising, and those costs go under the consulting area in the budget. And what's required as far as information for your consultant costs is they're for non-employee SBDC advisors, trainers, and other staff who provide client services on an hourly or fee-for-service basis. And you need to provide their name if known. So I guess if you anticipated that you were going to expand your advising pool in the next, in 2018, and you were gonna, put out a call for new advisors, you could just sort of put something in the narrative about that. That would be the only instance I could think of that you didn't know someone's name. Specify the purpose and indicate the number of hours and rate of pay. And the last direct cost category is other. And here you would list all expenses included in this cost category separately with a plan per cost item. Other expenses may include, but are not limited to, computer software, copying, postage, printing, publications, subscriptions, dues, telephone, conference fees, office space rental. And honestly, I get confused sometimes about what SBDC wants under the other category because, you know, as I'm reading this list and it says, well, computer software, but we were just talking about computers being under supplies. So why would I put computer software under other? So the way I've sort of dealt with that is follow your host policy. If your host policy says that, you know, computer software is a supply, then, you know, put it under supplies. My idea of other is that there is kind of a catch-all place that if your host policy and procedures don't tell you to break things out into any of the other categories, any of the personnel, fringe, equipment, supply, contractual, consultant categories, then this is where the your expenses are going to show up in the budget, basically. If rental costs are proposed, provide square footage required for SBDC activities and rate. If nominal costs for meals and hospitality expenses associated with client workshops or related events are proposed, include a justification that demonstrates such costs are reasonable and necessary to support the SBDC program mission and goals. Details may be included on the budget justification form, budget narrative, or in a clearly marked section of the technical narrative. And this, I just kind of focus on this a little bit, especially about the hospitality expenses. So SBA is really kind of calling out that the expenses for meals should be nominal for client workshops and related events, and that they really want them included in the budget. And the whole great thing about this budget is that if you say in this budget and you can justify it in this budget and we submit it to SBA and they approve it, that says that you're allowed to spend the money. They're giving you prior approval. So if you are truly planning on spending money on hospitality for your workshops or for something else, please include it in this because it's much easier to show SBA when they come out to do site visits or desk audits that this is an allowable expense because you said what you were going to do ahead of time and then you followed your plan. It wasn't that, oh, this was a surprise, you know, charge that you didn't tell anyone about, and now we're going to fight over if it's allowable or not after the fact. And the last piece is do not list other items with zero amounts. And this is where they're just saying in the other section, if last year you had a line item for membership fees and then in 2018 you're not going to have that, just delete the memberships. Don't just have it listed there with no amount there. It's just kind of to reduce confusion. It's just kind of a little picky thing, but indirect. And so we're done with the direct expenses and talking about indirect. Show indirect cost amount on line J of the budget justification only. Do not include indirect costs as cash match or as in-kind contributions or as a contractual cost category. A rate no higher than that approved by your cognizant agency should be used to estimate indirect costs, except that organizations that don't have an indirect cost rate agreement, and they can use this 10% de minimis rate. SBA does have a basic indirect rate agreement of 24% if centers don't have a host with an approved cognizant agency agreement. So none of the centers have ever used this 10% de minimis rate in the past, so we can kind of ignore that. But we either have centers using a 24% rate agreement or higher or different ones. So hopefully you know which one you're using, and we plug those numbers into the budget proposal, and there's a way that it auto-calculates the waived indirect. This section up here is important in that if you're going to show what you're going to spend for cash match, and you're going to spend $100,000 on cash match, and at Humboldt State, our host does take indirect on some of our cash match expenses. So if I spend $1 of some of my grant funds that I can include as cash match, my host is charging me 20 cents every time I spend that dollar. However, I'm not going to show that indirect amount on my SBDC budget, and it's just going to be counted as waived indirect, and I don't want to get into that in too much detail, but just count the cash direct expenses. The indirect is not included as match. They don't consider that as a match, and the match is just captured in your waived indirect as your host contribution to the effort. So those are the different cost categories, and let me switch screens and hopefully successfully, and show you what the budget proposal template is going to look like. And let me see here. Okay, so everyone's seen that? And trusting Arrow will tell me if you're not seeing that because he's co-hosting with me today. Okay. So this is when I was mentioning what your proposal template is going to look like. This is it, and this is the first page. So you're going to be filling in the spots that have blue, and so if I was filling this in, it'd be the name of the applicant and the host, and so here I would be putting Humboldt State and sponsored programs, foundation, and I'd put in their email address or their mailing address and the official host contact name, so that would be Stephen Karp, and his title, which is Interim Dean of Research, and then I would put in the service center name, and that's your branded name that you're using. So in my case, it would be Northern California SBDC Lead Center. If it's Santa Cruz, it would be Santa Cruz SBDC, whatever the center is, and the contact information, the service center name. And if you follow this and fill it out the way in order, so fill out tab A first and then fill out tab B, tab C, it's going to work out, and it's going to start auto-filling for you as you go along. And so here, for example, if I type in Stephen Karp, and then, it's showing up here. So if I type everything in the blue spot, then the name is also going to show up here. And so now I need to get, a signature in box and this box and down here. So page 3, there's 3 different signatures, and that's something that people get confused about, that they'll get one signature. However, these are sort of different certifications, and we need to have them signed off on separately. All right, budget certification, that's the next tab. And again, please start filling it out in order, and it'll start helping you and calculating for you. So if you were to put in your cash match sources, so one of mine would be GoBiz funding, and brief description of what it's for, and it's for access to capital advising. And so this is where it can get slightly tricky, because GoBiz is a fiscal year grant. It goes from July 1st to June 30th. And and I'm not being as specific as I should. So I would need to also put that this is governor's office. It's asking for the funding entity, the grant name, so I would put a little more information in this first column A. And so then I would put a brief description of what the funding is for. It's for access to capital advising, the dollar amount. So if my fiscal year grant last year was $50,000, then, and I would say, is this funding already secured? The answer could be, I would probably say no here, because we haven't secured it for fiscal year 17-18, which is going to have to be half of this. So you're kind of putting together 2 years here, and you can just say, no, it's not secured, and if not secured, when do you expect it to be secured? And so I would expect the governor's office to be secured, oh gosh, let's hope by June 15th, 2017. An expected period of performance would be the 17th through 18th, fiscal year 2017 through 2018. And as I'm saying this, and I haven't filled out these forms in a year, I'm going to revise this and say that you should do 2 entries. So you should do 1 for each fiscal year. And so you would, if you normally get $50,000 each grant period, then you could put that, please list all individual sources attachment, and there's just funny. You could put something, I'm sorry, 50,000. And you could say yes, that you have funding for fiscal year, and it would be 16-17. And so you can show that you have funding for both years. You can do it that way. And then we wouldn't have to put anything here because you have a yes here. Okay, and so then it's auto-calculating here, and it's showing that at this point there's $100,000. This is not a perfect system in the sense that some of this money, for example, would be spent in meeting your contractual obligation for this current year that we're in, for calendar year 2017. So if you fill this out, you're going to end up with more cash match here than you're actually going to end up spending in calendar year 17, which is confusing when you're kind of going through this process. But right now, you're listing out all your different contracts, and they're going to add up. They could add up to 500,000, but that doesn't mean that you're going to use that 500,000 to match your $100,000 in SBDC funding. So we'll get to that. But this is where you're just listing out all your potential expected sources of match that are going to be going towards the SBDC program. And this is where Kristen and I are looking and seeing, and Kristen, for those of you who are new or working for the host organizations that don't know her, she's the director of the region. We're going to be looking and seeing if someone listed a grant source that is federal funds perhaps, and they're not realizing that, and making sure that the description is in line with business advising and the SBDC's core mission, and so that it's not off topic as far as being in line with the scope of the SBDC grant. So those are some of the things that we're looking for. Any questions about this? Because there can be quite a few questions about it. And as you're working through this, you know, next month, just call and we can talk through your different examples and different situations and figure out the best way to represent them. And so these sources that you're listing here, this information ends up showing up again on your invoices. So we're kind of switching topics, but you're now starting to fill out your January through March 2017 invoice templates, and these certifications of cash match, this is where this information originates from, is it originates from your proposal and what you said in your proposal. All right, then in-kind. So one of the main sources of in-kind is facilities, and so include the name of the donating entity. So let's say, Solano Community College, and brief description of what it's for. So it'd be SBDC office space, and what the dollar amount is, and it's $13,000, and is it a new, or was it used in the past, and it was used in the past, and documentation type to be used, and be 3 market rate comparisons. So that's what we do. And leave this waived indirect, it's actually locked. Leave that alone, because that's going to auto-calculate for you, and it has a little memo that pops up. It says field auto-calculate. So leave that alone. We're going to go on to the next tab, and it'll auto-calculate for us. And I have these notes in column I that are kind of giving you some hints. So, and then there's more signatures, and Stephen Karp's name is there, and there's a signature spot. Is everyone doing okay? Any questions? Okay. Detailed budget. Let's see. So this is a little bit too big, and get this to the kind of a good size here. All right. So you will list the person, the first person on line 8, for example, John Smith. There's a spot for an account code if that's helpful to you. If you have different account codes for hourly employees versus salary employees, things like that. And then the 12-month salary. And this is a spot that gets confusing for people. So what you would do is say director and John Smith, and that he makes $90,000, and that is what he makes working 40 hours a week at, SBDC might only be a portion of his time, but that's the whole salary that he makes at his host. And so that's what we want to reflect there. His full-time equivalent salary, his FTE. And so then we're going to say that, in fact, he's only going to be doing SBDC work 80% time for some reason. And so then we're going to show that, actually, so that my brain doesn't have to work so hard, let's say he's making $100,000. And so then we're going to say that $80,000 is being charged to the SBA grant, and trying to see if you can see this double check over here. And there's a double check right here that's saying that, yes, that's correct. Does your time base and your total salary charged match? And that's where this and this need to be correct, or this is not going to work out, and SBA cares about this, and I have to prepare this personnel list, which you don't see and you don't have to prepare, but I have to turn it in with my proposal for the region, and I need this information for that. You know, another option is that you could charge $60,000 here, and you could charge $20,000 here, and that would be fine too, and you would still end up with $80,000. So this SBDC time base is how much, what the expenses are going to be towards the SBDC program, if it's cash match or federal. And so then you go down to your fringe, and SBA, you can do this a couple different ways. I've set this up right now to calculate sort of a basic fringe per person. However, at HSU, for example, we actually prepare our budgets based on the percentage charged for a set amount that's charged for medical, a percentage that's charged for Social Security, and all the various types of expenses that are broken out that come up with fringe. So if this works for you, putting in a total percentage per person, that's okay. I can work with you to do it differently if that's better given your situation. And we can, you know, work with this template and send you out a revised one. Then travel. So I'm just looking at this before I send it out. I'm going to obviously have to update the mileage that's listed here, because it's, you know, the mileage rate has gone down for 2017, and we'll expect it'll stay that way for 2018. And so you will be, do that. So I have it locked. So you'll just be listing, you know, that you expect that you're going to spend $2,000 for doing mileage around the state just to go to client appointments, etc. And this is going to auto calculate for you that based on this rate, you are going to be traveling 3,738 miles. So I'm trying to make it easy for you to give SBA some of the details that they want without having to do extra calculations if possible. And so then they're asking for airfare in state, hotel in state, per diem, other in-state meetings. So this is where you put regional meetings and the number of staff. ASBDC conference, if you're planning on going to that. It's in Nashville this year, by the way, for cost estimates. And then moving on to equipment, we don't use that. Supplies, contractual, and oh, you know what, and I'm going to change this for this year actually, because this is different. So we would just have website or IT support, if that made sense in your world, things like that, whatever would make sense in your world. A lot of centers don't use this section very much. And then consultants, this is where, you know, a lot of your core expenses are going to be. So this is going to be your SBDC business advisors. You can break it out with trainings as well. You can break it out with access to capital and non-access to capital if that's helpful for you. I do that with my budget. And then we get to other, and you can list whatever that is at your center that didn't fall into any of the other categories. And we need to keep facilities separate because indirect rate agreements have us calculate indirect rates differently for facilities for most centers. So that's the main direct expenses. And then for indirect, this can get a little bit confusing, that you need to put in what your cash indirect is that you're allowed to take on the federal funds. And so for several centers, that's 4% that you would put here. And then that's going to auto-calculate the cash that you get to take for the overhead at, well, your host takes as overhead at the center. And this can be a different rate too, but for several centers it is 4%. And then the total indirect rate, if you're using the SBA agreement, then this would be 24%. If you have a different agreement, you would use that rate. And so then when you put in that number, that auto calculates and gives you your waived indirect in column J. And if you go back here, it auto calculates and gives you this number for the waived indirect for your certification form. Okay. Oh, and these columns in red, these are ones that when I turn this into SBDC, these get hidden. So that's why they're in red. And Kristen likes to know about them, and I like to know about them. I'm thinking of Mendocino as an example, in that they don't have very much money in federal funds. However, they have quite a significant amount of money. They have a WBC, which is another federal entity that supports the SBDC program. And so we can tell by looking at this section that even if there's not a lot of expenses in this SBDC portion of the budget, they're going to have enough money to cover their costs for the year. So that's why those two columns are there. It's Contra Costa as well. They have several sources of federal funds that wouldn't show up anywhere else if we didn't have those columns. So that's why that's there. What's kind of confusing is those amounts. If I, let's see if I do this, if I put a dollar amount here, it's not going to change this total, because this column is the one I need to turn into SBDC, and I don't need to turn this information into SBDC, but the lead center wants it. So all these different ways to slice and dice things, but that's another little weird situation. Okay, so then D, budget narrative. This is where you need to put something next to any of the dollar amounts that you have listed here. And so you could put something about, you could say something like 80% of directors' time to support SBDC program, other 20% to support whatever the case is, if it is to support another grant, perhaps. And that would be okay. Benefits, you could list out the different types of benefits. If you're saying that this 24% includes Social Security, medical, et cetera, you could list that there. Travel, just what the expected, we kind of went over that in the slide, all the details you need to put in there. And then if you did put any dollar amounts down here, you would need to put that. So, and this should be auto-calculating and matching your final dollar amount that's on this detailed budget. So 125,488, 125,488 if it's calculating correctly. And then the waived indirect, that's an auto calculation that's happening. And then the performance milestones, that's going to be an auto calculation that's going to be happening and kind of show you the milestones. Service center locations, this is where column A, you need to initial next to your center. And so let's pick on North Coast for a minute. And so we would see that they have a satellite location, and amber where is the point of contact. And I think that address has changed, for example. So that address would need to be updated. And then obviously the point of contact would need to be updated because Sandy's retired. So, and the email address and things like that. So those would be the things that you would update and then put your initials by it as a center director and submit it. Closure dates. So we will, when this gets updated to 2018, we kind of list the regular holidays that most people take off during the year. And then you can list if your center is taking off the same dates or different dates or things like that. And then there's some others that you can specify what those might be if you are using those dates. Planned workshops. So this is where you put the name of the workshop, who are you targeting, what the fee might be, the purpose of the workshop, and how many times is it offered each quarter. And then the organizational chart for your center. And you don't have to try to fit it into this Excel thing. You could send it separately, but it's just kind of a placeholder that it goes there. So that's it. Tried to keep it to an hour. It's a lot of information though. So yeah, any questions, or you can feel free to follow up with me after an arrow. I'm not sure if people are muted and can't talk, or if you are able to unmute yourselves if needed. I'm not always sure how this all works.
In the car, there was only 3. Well, I figured out to defrost.
Oh.
Hey, I just unmuted everybody if anyone is having trouble unmuting themselves but had a question.
It's like there's 3 speeds.
It doesn't look like anyone.
Okay. I just mute people, and just if people need to let me know, they can. Okay. So feel free to follow up, and thank you so much for your attention today, and we'll be working on this next month. All right, thank you.